Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of SmartTips. I'm Avi Hersenberg, head of partnerships here at SmartSuite, and today we're going to cover how you can set default values in SmartSuite. So, from within SmartSuite, anytime you set up a custom field type, many of the different custom field types have what we call default fields. And so, what that means is that if you set a default field, anytime that you add a new record, that field type will have the default value that you set. So let's take a look how this works. Let's go into status, for example. And when you go into status, and you can obviously customize the different statuses, you can go into default, this tab over here, and you can select a default status. So let's say default status is always planned. This means that anytime I add a record, I want the status to always start at planned until I move it to something else. And so now, going forward, anytime I add a new record, and let's take a look at that. So I can go ahead and add a test record here, and you can see that the status is already set to planned. I can obviously remove that to no status, or I can move it to concept, or I can move it to any other status. But as you saw, when I started filling out the record, the status was already pre-filled. And that will happen from any case. So for example, if an automation creates a record, unless I specified a particular status value, the status will be the default field type. Now it's important to note that the default field types are available on basically most of our field types. So if you take a look at the assignee field type, you can have a default assignee that will be the record creator. And so this is actually very useful. Imagine every time someone creates something in the marketing plans, I want to assume that whoever's creating that record is the person that is responsible or assigned to it. And so the default can always be record creator. That doesn't mean that going forward, so for example, let's do that, right? So default, we're going to say record creator, and I'm going to update the field. And so that doesn't mean that I can't create a record for someone else, but that does mean that if I do create another record, by default, I'm the assignee. I can obviously remove that or change, right? So if I add over here, I can, always remove myself as the assignee or add someone else as the assignee. But by default, I was the one who was assigned. So this makes both filling out data easier and also compliance easier so that the defaults are always set to proper defaults. Let's take a look at the date field type. You can have dates that will always be a specific date range, right, by default, or if it's an actual date field as opposed to like a due date field, so the default can be today plus a certain amount of days, or a specific date. So those are also very helpful default field types when it comes to dates. Let's take a look at a few more field types. So in checklists, this is also a very useful field type. So I can have checklists, which are basically quick to do items that are nested under the main parent task, and I can add due dates and assign to and so on. But then if I go into the checklist settings, I can set up default checklists. And then every time I add a new record, this default checklist will appear. And so this is very helpful. For example, let's say you have a specific punch list that you have to do every time you're producing a piece of content. And so as long as you set up default checklists, anytime you set up a new record with a piece of content you want to add, you'll have those default punch lists that anyone who's creating that piece of content has to go through. Another piece is going to be SmartDocs. So SmartDocs also has default. So I can expand this and have a full doc, and I can, write up a certain description or certain instructions or whatever you want to put in the SmartDoc. And that will be a default text that anytime I add a new record, that SmartDoc will appear. And so I'd suggest going through many of the different field types and looking through to see, what types of defaults, what type of field types have the defaults, and what types of defaults you can set for each of these custom fields. And that way, anytime you're adding records, automatically you'll have all of your default you'll have your default values in the records that you're creating, and it will make your life much easier, and you'll be able to add and maneuver around records much quicker. I hope you enjoyed this episode of SmartTips. If you'd like to see more, please subscribe to our YouTube channel and check us out at smartsuite.com for a free trial.